The laughter came before the thaw, that bitter, cruel laughter that always floated from the row of cabins down North Riverbank, where the men wore fresh boots and the women kept clean aprons, and the fires never seemed to run out. Off wood, they'd watched her dragging planks that winter, half-rotted timbers, scavenged wagon beams, old floorboards peppered with nail holes, and they'd stood shoulder to shoulder, half-hunched against the cold, chuckling like boys who didn't think they'd be seen, because to them, what she was building looked stupid, a cabin inside a barn, the Vera barn, that had its roof punched in by the last windstorm, the same barn whose western wall leaned like a drunk against trees, the same widow who had no husband, no horse, and 3 children who barely spoke above a whisper. They'd laud, but not one of them came to help, not when she'd spent 6 days hauling stone in her apron to make a floor no wind could pierce, not when she'd carved out space for 2 beds and a stove in a place that still stank off mule sweat and broken hay, not even when her fingers split open from the cold and she kept working anyway, her Ian just crying from the shadows of that barn skeleton. They just watched, they laughed, and they waited, certain she'd break, but she didn't break. She bent in places. Yes, like when her knees gave out from lifting too much, or when thunderstorm nearly pulled the tarp off the half-finished roof, or when she had to boil leather to make broth, but she didn't break. That barn had been a joke. The way it sagged and moaned in the wind, but now it had walls within walls, now it had a heart, now it had heat, and long before spring, the men who laughed started noticing something they couldn't. Keck's slain her chimneys smoked longer, her windows didn't frost up the same, and the footprints outside her barn stayed soft longer than theirs did, like the snow wasn't biting as hard where she lived. It started in late November, 2 days after the freeze rolled in. They said it wasn't going to be a hard year. That's what men like Harlan Dway and E. Sanders had told the town. The river was running long into October. The squirrels weren't nesting too deep, and the sky had that soft kind of grey that never seemed to settle into a storm. But they were wrong. The first cold snap came fast and hard, sinking the ground like a hammer into granite. And by the time folks realized how bad it was, the wells were capped in ice, and the trees snapped at night like gunfire. Lena Coyle didn't have time to be wrong. Her husband had died the summer prior, lungs full of blood after a fall from the mill scaffolding. They'd been promised Pathat never came, and she'd buried him with the last coin she had. Their house, a thin-walled shack near the creek, had been taken for lumber by the town's new builder, traded off to another settler with stronger arms and a second ox. She and her children had been given permission to stay temporarily in the remains of the barn at the edge of the old grain fields. The roof was half gone. The wind moved straight through the ribs of the place, and the only insulation was a broken half-wall and one mud-choked trough. But Lena had something the others didn't, something meaner than hunger, colder than frost, and deeper than pity. She had desperation. The day she made her decision, the wind was biting so loud it drowned out her daughters crying. Little Ruthie, 6 years old, and already so quiet from too much cold and not enough bread, had curled up beside the barn's support beam and whispered Thatch didn't want to be alive if her feet hurt like this forever. Matt did it. Lena had no grand plan, just hands, grit, and a memory of what her grandmother once did in a mountain winter when the chimney collapsed and there was no place to run. She started be walling off a corner of the barn, not with logs which she couldn't afford or fell, but with planks scavenged from broken carts and shattered fences. Anything she could nail, tie, or wedge into place. She layered them like she used rags, wool scraps, dried grass, and even animal hides to patch gaps. Then within that corner, she built an inner wall, a tighter space with no air gaps, just a womb of overlapping materials. She built a false floor over the dirt raised, just enough to stay dry, then a stove made from a salvaged iron barrel stuffed with stone heated each night. By the second week of December, the structure had changed. The barn still looked ruined from the outside, but inside it felt different. It held heat, it trapped breath. The air no longer stung her lungs. She could work in her sleeves, rolled up. The baby Ephraim no longer wheezed through the night. He noticed that snow didn't gather on her makeshift roof, the heat gently melting it off in a way the other homes couldn't manage, and the other settlers noticed, too. And that's when the whispering started. The same men who'd laughed now murmured. Some said she'd used magic. Others said she must be stealing wood, hiding it underground. One woman accused her of filling up the place with animal fat and tar like some savage. A few whispered that maybe her husband hadn't died. Maybe he'd hidden away in there, working the stove all night in secret. But no one came to ask Lena herself. They didn't dare. Not after the time Harlan Dwy got close and saw her face, hollow-eyed, stiff-backed and sunken like curved wood. A face not afraid of them, not interested in explanations, just cold, tired, fury, and a quiet, kind offering that burned hotter than any of their hearths. Then, just after New Year's, the test came. A snowstorm thickened that blotted out the stars, rolled in like a curtain across the valley. Temperatures dropped to something beyond memories. The wind crushed porch beams, knocked in windows, and buried livestock alive. Most families huddled together in their root cellars or in the center of their homes, wrapped in every blanket they had, praying their chimneys didn't clog or collapse. But Lena and her children slept in shirt sleeves tucked against the heat stone floor while steam crawled from the cracks of her inner walls like breath from a sleeping animal. That's when the stories stopped buying jokes. That's when the knocking started. Not loud, not proud, but a kind of scratchy, uncertain tap. The first was from a boy, 15 or so, whose parents hadn't come back from the woods and whose cabin had blown its roof off. She let him in. The second was a mother with frostbitten fingers and a baby near freezing. She let them in, too. Then 3 more, and then 5, and then they just kept coming until she'd packed nearly 9 souls inside that inner space. She didn't turn away a single one. The walls held, the heat stayed, and through that 3-day storm, that broken barn, once a joke, once a ruin, became the only place in the valley where breath didn't fog and bones didn't ache. When the skies cleared, the settlers emerged like survivors of a war, faces gray, limbs stiff, eyes darting. And then they saw the smoke still gently rising from Lena's barn chimney, thin and steady. That's when the laughter stopped for good. That's when they started saying maybe she knew something they didn't. That's when some started watching a little more closely, tracing her steps, studying the curve of her roof, the placement of her walls, the shape of her stove. But they were too late. The storm had passed, but Lena had proven herself. Not just clever, not just tough, but something scarier than both. She'd survived when the rest barely did, with no husband, no horse, no real roof, just a cabin inside a barn, and the will to make it burn hotter than anything they could understand. And something was coming again. She could feel it in the wood, in the stillness, in the way the trees held their breath at night. And when a Camathay'd come knocking again, there was a strange quiet in the town after that storm passed, the kind that settled in taith corners of windows, creaked behind the hinges, and hovered just above conversations that never finished, thickened of silence that came not from peace, but from something left unsaid. Lena Coyle could hear it when she crossed the field toward the well. She could feel it in the way eyes followed her, not in open contempt anymore, but in something else, hesitation, discomfort, maybe even envy. They didn't call out like before. They didn't chuckle when she passed. Now they just watched, eyes full of questions they wouldn't ask, hands fidgeting near belts and sleeves, as if unsure whether to wave or turn away. She didn't mind. Not really. Let them stew in it. That world had already taken enough from her. Her husband, her home, her sleep, her faith, and she wasn't about to give them her dignity, too. But what bothered her wasn't the air silence. It was the thaw that followed it. The snow receded in patches, then lines, then deep trenches through the valley where meltwater ran like veins. This would have been a relief to most, a sign of coming spring, a break in the endless white, but not to Lena, because thaw meant change, and change never came free. The barn cabin had held strong through the worst freeze in living memory, but it was never Minto face ring. The roof patchwork she'd made, so clever and tight in the cold, now began to sag with moisture. It's of cliff, bark, and hide sucking in damp like a sponge. Every morning brought a new drip. Every night brought a new wind that loosened another seam. She didn't have time to feel proud anymore. Not with water creeping through seams and her youngest coughing hard enough to make his ribs jump. The boy Ephraim had always been fragile, even before the winter, even back when her husband was still alive and everything felt stable. He was small for his age, quiet, prone to fevers. He'd been born under a bad moon, the midwife said, too early, too blue, too still. Lena had breathed him back into life. the night with her own lungs, refusing to let the child go. But now the cold had bitten deep. He was paler than ever, his sleep was restless, and when he woke, his hands trembled like old paper caught in a breeze. The others had moved out by then. The boy with no parents had gone to work for the blacksmith, trading muskle for bread. The mother, with frostbitten hands, had followed her brother south, to where the trees bloomed dearly and water flowed warm. One by one, they'd all gone, whispering thanks, pressing what few coins or dry goods he had into Lena's hands before slipping away. Now it was just her and her three again, and the walls for the first time felt thinner. She patched what she could, stripped the old sod from the outer barn wall, packed it in thinner crevices, peeled strips from her own bedding to seal corners. At one point, she even ground pine resin from bark and boiled it down with ash to make a crude tar, smearing it with her bare palms until her fingers bled. But Shek knew it was a losing fight. The warmth inside the barn no longer stayed as long. The stove, her cobbled togi thermorockel, burned hotter, faster, more desperately, as though it too sensed the change in season and feared its would pile. Once enough to last into March, began dwindling. She rationed it, fed the stove sparingly, kept her children close to the hot stones that lay beneath the floor she'd made. Still, Ephraim's cough deepened, and then Kamithi rider. No one came out that way by accident. Not in late January, not when the roads were soup and the wind still whispered frost from the north. But she heard the hooves before she saw the figure, slow plotting the distinct uneven gait of a half-starved horse. And when the figure finally came into view, Lena's whole body tensed. It was a man she hadn't seen in over a year, Dean McCale, a cousin of her late husband, a lean, long-limbed man with a sloping brow and fingers too quick around a flask. He'd always been trouble, even when he smiled. And now drenched in mutant slush, he looked like trouble that had been dragged through the worst parts of a storm. He didn't ask permission, just dismounted like he belonged, looked over the barn with a crooked grin and spat into the snow. "Well, I'll be," he said. "You actually built the damn thing." Lena stood her ground in the barn door, hands curled into fists behind her apron. "What do you want?" she asked. He gave a shrug, casual, as if the past hadn't happened, as if he hadn't once tried to convince her husband to sell their home for gambling debts. He was just passing through, he said. "Heard tell of a widow built a miracle barn out this way. Thought I'd see it for myself." "You've seen it. Keep moving." His smile widened, but his eyes didn't. "You always were the fire, weren't you?" he said. "Jared used to say you'd keep burning even after the world froze." He never said it with kindness, but he wasn't wrong. Lena didn't move, didn't link. He stepped closer and got a proposition. He said, "Storms are easing up, but they'll be back. Always are, and folks out there, they talk. They say you made a heat trap that don't burn near as much wood. I figure there's profit in that. Maybe we partner, build more like it. You handle the fixing, I handle the folks." "No," he blinked. "Don't need tones where now." I said no. Something hardened in his face. The smile cracked. His eyes narrowed. "Don't be stupid, Lena. Woman like you in a place like this. You think they'll let you keep it?" She didn't flinch. "Let them try." There was a long pause. Then he gave a small, sharp laugh and stepped back, turned to his horse. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't say I didn't offer." He left without another word, and she watched until his silhouette was gone, but Thetrable stayed behind. That night, she awoke to the sound of rustling. At first, she thought it was wind, then mice. But when she crept to the outer wall with her father's old hatchet in hand, she saw it. Scrape marks near the barn's side, where someone had tread pulling back a board. Quiet, deliberate. The sort of attempt made not by a stranger, but someone who wanted in without asking. She waited for 3 nights after, sleeping in fits, hatchet close, fire low. No one came again. But message was clear. They wanted it now. Her barn, her heat, her secret. Not with kindness, not with curiosity, with hunger, with that gnawing, frostbitten desperation that had once lived in her, but now lived in them. They saw Thuamth, and they wanted to own it. So Lena made a decision. The next morning, she took Ruthie and Ephraim and Caleb out into the woods, not far, just deep enough. And there, in a clearing surrounded by fir and alder, she began to dig. Not another shelter, not a backup, a vault. She'd seen what they were capable of, how their silence turned to greed, She didn't trust them not to take what she'd built. Not when spring came, not when they'd forgotten who bled to make it. So she dug a root cellar at first, then deeper. She lined it with stone, packed it with straw, buried jars of rendered fat and salted meat, and smoked bark. She even cached her 2 iron pots, the stove's backup chimney pipe, her hammer, and a bundle of good nails wrapped in oilskin. If he came and took the barn, she'd let them. But not the core, not what made it work, not the heart of the heat. And that night, when the wind came again, and Ephraim coughed until blood touched his lips, she knew she'd made the right choice. Because the storm wasn't over, it was just pausing, waiting. Like the men watching from their doorways, like Keth hunger in their eyes, like the laugh that would come again if she failed. And Lena Coyle had no intention of failing. Not for them, not for herself, and not for the boy who might not survive the next storm if she did. Ephraim squatted hollow 2 days after she buried the tools. It wasn't a sound Lena recognized. Not the wheeze of cold air, not the bark of a dry throw, but something deep rattling wrong. He didn't cry anymore. That frightened her most. Her boy had always been a soft sobber, whimpering even through his sleep when the nights grew too still. But now he lay too quietly, watching the rafters, face pale, lips dry, his small chest struggling like he had to remember how to rise and fall. She pulled the cot closer to the stove, rubbed his arms with lard, then cloth, then wool, fed him warm broth made from onion skins and smoked bark, slipped hot stones beneath his blankets. But the heat wasn't staying in him the way it stayed in something in him was pulling away 1 inch at a time, and she knew by the silence in his eyes that he had already seen something cold and far off. Lena didn't cry. She hadn't, in weeks. But that night, when Ruthie and Caleb were asleep, and the wind outside blew steady and cruel through the broken barn timbers, she sat beside her youngest, and wept so quietly her shoulders barely moved. The barn creaked in sympathy, or perhaps warning, and the soft hiss of the stove became the only thing, louder than her breath. She had no medicine, no doctor, and no one to ride out in Findoni. The town had turned its back the moment her husband died. He hadn't been a man of favor. Jared had owed too many people too many things, and when he fell from that scaffolding, no one grieved. They only waited for her to leave. Butch didn't. She had nowhere to go, and so she remained, a ghost between fences, tolerated but never trusted, pitied but never helped. They watched her break her hands, building heat while they sat inside homes of better stone and thick, and then they whispered when her heat outlasted theirs. And now they watched again, curious, jealous, but still silent, until that morning. It began with footsteps in snow that hadn't fallen yet. She heard them from inside of the barn. 4, maybe 5 sets, soft, cautious, not the clump of men with intent, but the careful walk of people unsure of what they were about to find. She stood, broom in hand, like a staff, and waited. The knock was softer than she expected. She opened the barn door only wide enough to look. It was Lillian Marsh and her 2 boys, along with Ben Carter from down by the ridge and his older sister, June. All of them looked worse than they had before. Sunken cheeks, frostbitten fingers, blank stares. Ben stepped forward. His voice cracked as he spoke. We heard your boy's sick." Lena didn't answer. She looked past them toward the tree line. "Did Mail send you?" "No," Ben said quickly. "No, he left road south. Said you turned him down." Lena still didn't trust it, but she didn't close the door. Lillian's voice came next, thin, tired. "We came because we want to help. If you'll let us help." That word, it hung strange in the air like foreign smoke. She studied their faces. The desperation was real, but so was the shame. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Ben swallowed. "Nothing. Just maybe learn how you built it. Not the stove. Just the way it holds warmth." Lillian looked at Anne. "I got herbs. My father was an apothecary once. Not much left, but maybe something to soothe the boy." Lena didn't want to say yes, but Ephraim hadn't eaten in a day, and his skin had turned a shade she couldn't explain. So she opened the door, but she didn't step aside. "You stay by the fire. Don't touch the walls. Don't ask questions you don't need answers to. And when the boy sleeps, you leave." They nodded, and for the next 3 hours, the barn was quiet again. Lillian made tea from a sack of dried weeds that smelled like earth and ash. She dabbed Ephraim's lips with cloth, whispered old words Lena didn't recognize. The boys stayed by the stove, warming their hands without speaking. Ben watched the corners of the room, the way the seams of the wall overlapped, the layers of plank, rag, and wool that made up a makeshift insulation, but he said nothing. By dusk, Ephraim was sleeping without a rattle. Not well nut-heeled, but breathing easier. Lena stared at the boy's chest for a long time. When she finally looked up, Ben met her eyes. "Huh, that's clever work," he said quietly. "The floor vents, the overlapping planks. He pulled in stone from somewhere to hold heat under the bedding. No one else even thought of that." Lena didn't respond. Ben didn't push, but his face said enough. The next day, others came. A man with frostbite on 3 fingers. A woman whose baby wouldn't stop crying. A young girl who hadn't eaten in 3 days, not asking to stay, but asking to look, to learn. Towndes and Lena, against every instinct, every old wound, let them, not all at once, not in crowds, never too many under her roof, but slowly, carefully, she began to explain how stone under the floor radiated warmth longer than fire, how layering planks with air pockets created insulation, how sealing seams with bark, pitch and wool made every breeze die before it could cut. And they listened, because Lena's barn, broken as it was, still stood. Anti Town's newer homes were cracking, their hearths burning too much wood, their children coughing like Ephraim had by week's end. 4 families had begun copying her design. Not fully. They didn't have the same angles, teaser materials, but they adapted what they could. And the laughter that had once echoed across fields and porches, replaced by the sound of sawing, hammering, digging. Lena wasn't their equal, not yet. But she was no longer a shadow, either until the fire. It came just before dawn. A scream first, then the glow. Ben Carter's home, the ridge cabin. The blaze was high, thick, fast. By the time Lena reached it, half the structure was already gone. The wind caught flame like breath in a dry mouth. Smoke poured skyward. A child's cries pierced the dark. Someone shouted for water, but the buckets froze solid before they reached the flames. And then Lena saw it. The broken stump of a chimney, stone cracked, half melted, built from salvaged parts, the same way she'd taught them. She ran to the edge, the blaze clothed over her face, eyes burning. Ben stumbled from the side, coughing hard, dragging his sister by. One arm. "It was the vent," he cried. "I didn't insulate it right. The tar had cut." Someone screamed behind them. The roof fell, and just like that, the copy of her miracle became a grave. By morning, the town was split. Some whispered it was her fault, that her ideas had killed others, swore it wasn't her design, just Ben's failure to build it right. But Lena saw what was coming. They would blame her if they needed to. Just like they laughed before, just like they watched before. And now, after just a week of fleeting admiration, the eyes on her barn had changed again. Not with wonder, with suspicion, even fear. She couldn't stay, not unless she chose to fight. But what would she be fighting for? Not for comfort, not for pride, only for survival, only for a boy whose breath now came steady, but soft. 4 dear children who still slept close enough to hear the wolves howl in their dreams, for the idea that no one would ever again take what she had built. Out of grief, out of ruin, out of fire and ash. She was done being the barn widow. If they came for her now, they would find not a beggar, not a fool, but a woman who had learned to build warmth from cold and victory from laughter. She stepped outside that evening and looked at the sky. Another storm coming, thickened. That didn't break things. It tested them. Let it come. She had already buried the best parts underground. They could burn the shell if they wanted. But the heart, they'd never find it. The fire hadn't touched her barn, but surfing in the town had shifted as if it had. It lingered in the way people no longer looked her in the eye, in the way conversations stopped when she drew water, in how the children, who once ran ahead of their parents, now clung tighter to totems when she passed. The flame at Ben Carter's cabin might have eaten only timber and pitch, but in its wake, a different kind of heat spread, quiet, festering, eager for direction. Blaine was a luxury Lena could not afford, but Town could. She knew it the day the preacher came. He arrived mid-morning, boots coated with frost, hat clutched in only hand like he'd practiced contrition, but hadn't quite decided whether to wear it. Reverend Kilpatrick, tall, gaunt, worn at the eyes. a man who'd blessed her husband's grave with a voice that cracked, then avoided her for the better part of a year. Now he stood by the half-barn door with a face that wasn't judgment, but worse, pity. "May I speak with you, Sister Coyle?" She was splitting, kindling outside. She didn't stop. "I'm busy." He cleared his throat. "I won't stay long. Only there's concern after the fire. Ben's sister barely got out, and folks say let them say." His voice dropped, quiet, but not kind. "They're saying you taught him wrong, that you gave him plans meant to fail, that maybe what you built wasn't natural." That made her pause. "Not natural," she repeated, her breath frosting the air. "Lena," he said, stepping closer, "these are frightened people. Most won't say anything to your face, but they're watching, and Mail's back in town." That turned her fully. "He's what?" "Came back yesterday. Said he'd found investors. Said he could build heat traps better, cheaper, that he tried working with you, but you're fused. Now he's got people listening, men signing up to help build what he calls safe shelters, ones not made by desperate women without formal skill." She stared at the preacher, and in that moment, every sore muscle, every bloodied knuckle, every night of coughing children and ash-caked hands gathered behind her eyes. "You think he carry what they sign?" she asked. "Let them build. Let them trust. A man who's never worked a day honest in his life. But tell them this: if they come near this barn or my children, I will show them just how unnatural I can be." The preacher flinched, but to his credit, he didn't run. He left quietly. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the door, hatchet across her lap, listening. The wind was soft, not cold, just uncertain, like it too was waiting for something to break. And when she finally drifted off, it was to the sound of footsteps, not in the snow, but in her dream. A woman's footsteps, heavy, measured. Her grandmother again, not smiling, just looking and saying, as she always had in those long nights of fevered sleep, "They can't take what's buried." Lena woke before dawn and dressed the children in layers. "We're going out," she said. Deep, Caleb frowned. "We just went 3 days ago. We're not hiding food. We're building again." The place she chose was farther than before, nearly a full hour's walk, a dip in the woods where the ground hollowed between 3 old trees. She scraped it clear of snow with her shovel, tested soil beneath. Hard, dry, stable. "I need stone." She told Caleb. "How much?" "Enough to build a second floor under the earth." He blinked. "Like a cave, like a room no one sees. Not from above, not from standing close. And if someone tries to follow, they'll never find it." And so they built again. Not with the panic of winter's edge, but with the precision of people who knew they might not get another chance. She dug the hollow deep, then layered the floor with wide stone slabs. Used mud, moss, and clay to seal it from beneath. Roofed it with split logs covered in bark and wet sod. A second vault, not just for supplies, but for them, for the children, for herself, for a night that might yet come. Every day she worked, she expected townsfolk to confront her, but no one came. Not directly. Instead, she saw the signs of Mail's rise. New caverns going up with strange designs, tall chimneys, thin walls, wide-open vents that looked impressive but leaked heat like a sieve. She watched from afar as men hauled in, preak wood and iron pipes from some trader Mail had wrangled. They were proud, smiling. They clapped each other on the back like they'd solved winter. Then came the collapser. Storm, freak warm wind followed by hard freeze, hit the town like a whip. 3 of Mail's new homes cracked, 1 folded. The rest bled, smoke, and couldn't hold heat. And Lena's barn, still standing, still warm, still glowing from within like a coal that refused to die. That was when they came. This time, no knocks. They waited for her to go out for water. When she returned, the barn door was open. Inside stood Mail along with 2 of his new partners. Men she didn't know, faces drawn and rough. One held a ledger, the other a rifle. "You'll want to calm yourself," Mail said, smiling like a snake in the sun. "We're just taking a look, cataloging, seeing what made this place work." Sawal. Lena stepped inside, slow, teeth clenched. "Get out." The man with the ledger snorted. "You don't own this land. Barnes County property. The only reason you're even on it is because folks felt sorry for you. You're trespassing." Mala stepped toward the stove, hand outstretched. "I offered to make you part of this." Could have had your name on it, but no, you had to play Queen of the Ashes. So now we're taking what we need." He touched the stove's edge. Lena moved fast. Hatchet out. She didn't swing. Not yet. But she put it flat against his forearm, just hard enough to press bone. "You will not take this," she said, voice low. The man with the rifle shifted. "You touch that trigger," she said without turning, "and I'll bury all three of you before the smoke clears." They looked at her, and for the first time, saw not a widow, not a woman in rags, but something harder. Mel pulled his hand back. "This ain't the end," he said. "They'll vote you off this land. Say you're a risk, a threat. Say you caused Ben's fire." Lena didn't blink. Let them come. He left, but she knew it was coming now. The last storm. Not wind, not snow. People, the kind that burn what they can't control. She waited 2 days. No one came. Then on the third night, Ephraim's cough returned. Worse, wet. She couldn't risk staying. She waited until dawn, packed what little food they had, wrapped the children in wool, and led them to the vault. They entered through the false bush-sheed, stacked near the tree line, slid the stone aside, crawled down. Inside it was dry, close, dark but safe. She had candles, blankets, stones to heat, enough to last 3 nights. She left the barn looking lived in, fire still going, door cracked, just enough to bait, and she waited. And when night fell, the first shadow appeared, then 2 more. Then the flicker of flame, then smoke. She saw the flames rise just after midnight. They bloomed too quickly to be accident, too deliberately placed to be chance. The barn caught from 3 sides at once, rags soaked in oil, maybe, or fire-fed by resin. She recognized the tactic. Jared once told her of a fire set like that during a lumber dispute, where Ammon's workshop was torched from multiple points, so no single corner could be saved. That had been justice, they'd claimed. Retribution for unpaid debts. This was arson. It took them less than an hour. The firelight clawed across the tree line, reflecting in the whites of her children's eyes. She made them keep still, crouched low in Thivo. Ruthie whimpered, but didn't cry. Caleb had an arm wrapped around Ephraim's shoulders like Ethosia. Pressure could make the boy breathe steadier. Lena held her breath with them, watching from behind the small vent slit she'd built with her own bloodied fingers. She saw them, saw who lit the torches, saw who didn't stop them. 3 of Mel's men, yes, but Alsatwa neighbors who'd once shared stew with her. 1 woman who had held Ephraim when he was a baby. A young man whose wagon axle she'd repair. Last fall, they weren't laughing this time. They weren't even angry. Their faces held that worst expression justification as if they'd convinced themselves this was necessary. As if warmth built by a widow was too much for pride to bear. As if survival not shared on their terms was somehow treason. The barn was gone, burning ashes soaked by steam. Smoke twisting high into the grey sky like a black column drawn in charcoal. No one searched for her. Not yet. No bodies meant no crime. No witnesses meant no guilt. Just quiet celebration in guilt-ridden hearts. Maybe they thought she'd left. Maybe they prayed she had. Maybe they hoped they'd never see her again so they could forget what they did. But she hadn't left. She was under their feet and she was watching. Ephraim bound with fever that day. Sweat pooling in the hollow of his collarbone. Leno fed him water drop by drop from Arag. Ruthie sang to him old mountain lullabies their father used to hum when sharpening his blades. Caleb kept guard at the vent with a knife he'd carved from a mule bone. They waited 3 days, then 4, then 5. On the 6th day, Ephraim woke without coughing, and on the 7th, Lena opened the vault. They didn't go in town. They went into the woods, further, deeper, until the smoke from the valley no longer reached them, and even Thuend seemed unsure where they'd gone. She led them to a canyon where old stone outcroppings formed natural shelves and hollers. There, she found a crevice, a seam in the land, and began again. Not a cabin, not a vault, something between a home carved, not built, woodless, fireless, heated with stone, and sealed with mud. She taught Caleb how to find moss that stayed dry even after rain, taught Ruthie how to braid grass into insulation, showed Ephraim, slowly recovering, how to stack earth in a way that held heat like a heartbeat. The new home didn't smoke, it didn't glow, it didn't announce itself, but it held warmth. Not 35 warmer, maybe only 10, maybe 15, but it was hers, and it was hidden, and it was safe, Meanwhile, the town changed again. The winter stretch shed longer than expected. March came with sleet, April with frost. The fancy homes Mail built cracked like eggshells under the pressure of shifting temperatures and poor design. No one admitted fault. They just blamed luck, blamed supplies, blamed the soil, and no one mentioned Lena. Not out loud, but in quiet moments, over cracked mugs. Behind drunker teens her name returned, whispered, hushed now, in mockery this time, in curiosity, in regret, in the same tone of people use when discussing ghosts. Some said she died in the barn. Others said she fled east. One claimed he saw her walking through the trees barefoot, dragging a sack of glowing coals that never went out. None of it was true, but none of it was false either. Because Lena Coyle had become something else. Not a settler, not a widow, not a woman defined by what the world had taken. She had become legend, not the kind etched in books, the kind buried in earth. Passed between mouths around low fires, told in hushed voices by children who didn't quite believe, but still looked over their shoulders when the wind moaned too long. Years later, a new group of settlers passed through heavily, looking for old trails. They stumbled on a pile of stone buried beneath moss. Inside they found ash, charcoal, a few shards of blackened metal, the remains of what had once been a stove, and in the trees beyond, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of life, only warmth, just a strange, inexplicable heat beneath the ground, in only quiet hollow, enough to melt the snow in a perfect circle, enough to make them shiver, though not from cold, enough to make them whisper to each other as they moved on. Someone lived here, someone smart, someone who didn't want to be found. They never saw her, but they felt heard the same way the cold does when it's about to leave, not with noise, but with absence, with silence, with the echo of something that refused to die, even when the world tried tobing it out. And that was Lena Coyle's final triumph. Not a house, not revenge, not even warmth, but survival so deep, so stubborn that it became invisible, undefeatable, and unforgettable.